As the father of a young man murdered on 9/11, I'm often asked what my opinion is of whether our situation has improved since 9/11. But as one who's been active for almost a decade in trying to get the government to implement policies that will protect us from terrorism, I have to rephrase the question more properly as, how much has our situation deteriorated since 9/11? And the answer is, from my point of view, frightening. The 9/11 Commission noted specifically the essential role that driver's licenses played in allowing the terrorists to carry out their attacks. These were the documents that allowed them to gain access to all that they needed to plan, finance, rehearse, and carry out the attacks. And yet, 10 years later, in this body, someone is introducing legislation that would give driver's licenses, authentic U.S. identity documents, to people who claim they arrived in the United States before age 16, who claim they are less than 35 years of age, and I find it difficult to find the words to describe how insane it is that 10 years after 9/11, an event during which driver's licenses were essential, according to the 9/11 Commission, in carrying out these attacks, that somebody would seriously consider granting licenses to illegal aliens. That is to say, an unknown person who may or may not be a terrorist or violent felon. And yet that is seriously proposed, not just in this state, but in others as well. The examples of malfeasance by our government are so many that it isn't possible to summarize them. Even the 9/11 Commission couldn't do a proper job. Let me give you one example. It is often cited that the terrorists had visas. But in fact, all these visas were issued in violation of State Department regulations and U.S. law. The 9/11 Commission named specifically 3 visa officials, Thomas Fury, Maura Hardy, and Mary Ryan, who violated the federal law and regulations to give visas essentially like candy for the asking to Saudi nationals and others from terror-sponsoring nations who should have been subjected to very severe screening. Now, as if that wasn't enough, the State Department the following year, in 2002, gave these 3 people performance bonuses for their work in 2001 and promotions. This is the kind of malfeasance and incompetence that is widespread in our government. And yet it doesn't even end with that. At the time of 9/11, 26 nations were eligible for what was called the Visa Waiver Program. That is, their citizens did not need to have visas to come to this country. All they needed was a passport, which may or may not be authentic, and they could come to the U.S. That wasn't enough for the greedy people at the travel industry and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which lobbied for a vast expansion of the Visa Waiver Program. And they successfully did so. In 2011, the Congress passed, and President Bush signed a law which virtually makes any country in the world eligible for the Visa Waiver Program if they meet certain vague requirements. And who decides who meets those vague requirements? But the very same State Department that rewards its own incompetent officials. At least the terrorists of 9/11 were required to fill out a form for a visa. Now that requirement is waived for who knows how many countries, and we're relying on a State Department to determine who has to fill out a visa. A final note. Again, this is not related directly to New York State, but this is federal, but it gives an indication of how frustrated we who have lost loved ones in terrorist attacks are. We all know of the infamous wall that prevented the counterterrorism division of the FBI from talking to the criminal division, from those divisions from talking to the CIA. And we know that that infamous wall was responsible for these divisions not being able to connect the dots that would have allowed them to derail the 9/11 plot before 9/11. Unfortunately, the very same person who is in large part responsible for that wall, Jamie Gorelick, was actually named to the 9/11 Commission, and instead of being a witness defending her actions, she was a judge in that commission.